Hello, and welcome back to the Wizard's Respite Sanctorum, the show that we dive into all things TTRPG. Today we are going to be talking a little bit about trouble spots that DMs, GMs might have at the game table, trying to get their players engaged, trying to get people, a little bit more active. You never want to see that one player sitting off in the corner, not really having an opportunity to play as much, just watching everybody else. And we're going to be diving deep into that and get some ideas going as to how to avoid that, how to climb out of that, how to stay out of that. But as always, I say we. I am not alone. I am joined with my co-host, Zachariah. Zach, how are you?
Hello, Zachariah from Old Man Gaming here, and I exist in a world, and I'm gonna try and talk about tabletop role-playing games.
That is that is what it's about. So that's what we're going to do. That is our that we are making it happen for everybody out there. Zach and I have both been very busy, and it's a little bit late in the evening, but we were just chatting about this. And this is, you know what? We've said this 1,000 times on this show. This is kind of like the fun thing to do. We don't ever get to talk shop with people, so we're going to talk
Yeah,
shop.
yeah, I agree.
Uh,
I agree.
and
Um,
hopefully help some DMs out there and GMs,
yeah, maybe some players when we're at it too. Who knows? Who knows? So,
Yeah.
what's the topic today, boss
Okay,
man?
so player engagement. From always having like everybody engaged isn't necessarily possible at every moment of the game table, but it is something that you're always trying to look for, and you never want to have one player basically just sitting there the entire session, watching everybody else play because their character never got the moment, or you weren't able to draw them out, or maybe they didn't feel. There's a lot of different reasons why characters or players aren't necessarily in the game at the moment. Um, so I think we're gonna dive into that a little bit and see if we can't come up with some advice. Maybe talk about horror stories where we weren't able to do this or where we learned something. And hopefully somebody out there will pick up on it.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I'm down with that. Player engagement is an interesting topic. It is a topic that I have also struggled with recently, which is something that I never had a problem with before. But yeah, it is. It's an interesting subject, and I think a lot of game masters. I don't think this is like this isn't the fancy like headline, right? Like it's
Right.
not the flashy headline, but I think more game masters than less will be very interested in like, oh yeah, this is usually like if you think back, what's the worst game that you ever had and why did it happen? It's usually because of player engagement, or
Right.
lack
Right.
thereof.
Yeah, you really want like the best games are literally when players are really in the moment for everybody. The
Yeah.
players being in the moment, but also the GM, not just because, everybody's playing, but also because the GM is like actively playing, participating the most when players are actively and the most engaged. If they're solving a problem or doing something unique or interesting, that's when you as a GM are thinking, how would the world react to this
Hmm.
new and interesting way the players are? So you really love it's the draw. It's what you really want to get from your players. It's to pull them into that.
Yeah,
So
and I think one of the biggest mistakes game masters, myself included, make is the story you're creating is going to seem really freaking interesting to you, like because you're the one writing it. Like it's going to be something out of your head. And I think that like you really need to take some time, stop and think about your players and put yourself in their position, what they like, what they dislike, and whether or not they're going to find it interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's always this fine balance, and you do hear a lot about this in the space, and a lot of people come down hard on one side and hard on another side. But that being, how much do you work with your players versus how much are you pandering to your players and making
Yeah.
it less of a game and more of a like, I don't know, social engagement where you're just coming up with random stuff to do.
Yeah.
Um, I'm a hard middle of the road kind of guy. It kind of like depends on the situation, the scenario. There's all of these different factors. Um, so you don't want to necessarily walk into a situation where your players don't feel challenged and they disengage for that reason, you know. But at the same time, like you just said, you want to make sure that it's something that your players want to do. It's fun
Mm-hmm.
for everybody. And so there's a fine line there. So actually, you know, why don't we dive into that as our first sort of area?
Sure.
Like, how have you sort of navigated that fine line of like maybe making sure that the players are still challenged but are engaged and feel in like this is something that they want to do. You're not pandering to them. You're investing in something that they're interested in playing.
It's tricky, right? Because you want to make a good story, but at the same time, you want to have everybody engaged, and at the same time, you want to make it make sense. And that doesn't always, those three things don't always run parallel to each other.
Right.
And I think that is a tricky situation. I think there's a couple of pitfalls to avoid. And then there's some things you can do when you fall into those pitfalls. The other big problem, I would say the biggest problem with player engagement that I've run into is split up parties. And parties split up. They just do. They just do. Like I know in your perfect world, you're thinking these 5 guys or 5 people are going to go on this mission and they're going to go through the dungeon together and they're going to get to the bad guy. It's just, they're not going to happen. And personally, I like to split up my party because when I split up my party, I take away key because those party members are like, well, I'll be the big guy, I'll be the smart guy, and I'll be the quick guy. And I was like, okay, well, now the quick guy's by himself. How does he get through the door that he's got to push down? So like, I think that like there are interesting moments in that. The tricky thing though is when you separate a party, you end up in this position where I'm playing with this person, then I'm playing with this person, then I'm playing with this person, then I'm playing with this person. So let me just run this out for you. Let's say you spend 15 minutes on a person, which doesn't sound like a long period of time. 15 minutes on one person before you switch, right? Say you're just playing 15 minutes on a person. That doesn't seem like a long time. However, let's say all of your party members are separated. Let's say you have 3 party members and they're in separate places. 15 minutes means a 45-minute full rotation. If you have a 4-hour game, that means they're all getting to play like 4 times.
Oh yeah.
So like that's when it gets tricky because back in the day, I've talked about my superhero game a ton and how proud I was of that. And that was one of those things where you played 3 times and then you got up from the table anyway, so it didn't really matter. But recently I tried to do something like that with a group, with a big group. It was like 5 players. And basically what ended up happening was you would spend long swaths of time. Like, okay, so now you got 5 players. If I'm even giving them 10 minutes, that's a 50-minute loop, okay? So player A does not get to play again for 45 minutes. He gets to play for 10 minutes, then he sits for 45 minutes till they come around. And when we were doing Astral Drive, which the 3 of you in Astral Drive cannot seem to stay together to save your fucking lives. But I think you guys have spent more time apart than you've ever been together, ever. Like, I think you've spent like 10 minutes together and then you've just been apart the entire time in different combinations of people. Yeah. That being said, I put a timer on that real quick. I watch a timer, 15 minutes, I switch. 15 minutes, I switch. But even that, like I said, that means you're sitting for 45 minutes. So like, not 40, in that case, you're sitting for a half an hour. A half an hour is a long time. How many times have we watched people fall asleep because they were waiting for a half an hour? There is something to be said about trying to make your game engaging enough that the other people want to hear what's going on in the other storyline and the other plot. But there is also something about these people are giving up their time, their hard-earned time to come play role-playing games with you, and they get to play for 20 minutes. That's not fair,
Right.
So it is a very tricky situation to do. I have only really seen a couple of guys navigate it really well, especially if you have a big party. I think that you have to switch off a lot. I think 5 minutes is like your timer. And I would say set a timer. 5 minutes. I know a guy, the guy I like, who I play on it right now. Johnny, if you're listening, probably not, but if you are, shout out to you. One of the things he does in his World of Darkness game is almost everybody's separate. There's like, and it's a huge group. It's like 6 players, and like almost everybody's separate. But everybody gets a reasonable amount of playtime, and I think most of that is because he switches off every time he calls for a roll. So if he calls for a roll, he goes, all right, you roll that, and I'm going to this person. And then I hate it because I have to somehow remember my roll for like the next like 10, 15 minutes. But yeah. So every time he calls for a roll, he switches off. So they're quick. He's in and out. It moves on. And he only stays on somebody when he can tell that everybody at the table is engaged in that thing.
That's a really interesting way of handling it. To be honest, like how you handled it in Astral Drive was fantastic. I really actually ended up like very much enjoying your pacing there, and you'd set the timer and you'd pop over. And I ended up employing more of that in my own games myself because parties do split, like you said, and so I had a lot of fun with it as a player. And as a DM, GM, there's a couple of things. Like, first, what you're saying, setting a timer, very useful. One thing that I would tweak a little bit with that is setting a timer as the maximum amount of time that it would go.
Yeah.
And it could be less.
Yeah.
It can't be more. And when it's less, it's really helpful if you can. It's not always possible, but it's really helpful when you can switch characters on a thematic cliffhanger beat if possible.
Yeah.
I
hate it.
It comes up.
Yeah.
Way more often than you might think. Like,
well, and that's why the guys switch on a roll is genius. Because it's like switch on the roll. It's like it's always a cliffhanger because you don't know if you succeeded or not. You've rolled the roll and you know the number. Like he doesn't give the difficulties either, so he'll just be like, "All right, give me." In World of Darkness, it's a success-based system, so he'll be like, "Give me an alertness roll," and you'll roll your alertness, and you'll have to remember your successes and hope that they were more than whatever difficulty he wrote down. So like, it's always a cliffhanger.
Like, even if it's a smaller role that maybe isn't quite as consequential, it's still a little bit of a cliffhanger. And then, of course, you are going to get a big important role. Mm-hmm. Like you're in every session. If you're bouncing around like that, every character is going to have at least one moderate to big role that is as important to them as an individual. Which is exactly what we're talking about. Engagement. It's important to them. They want to know what that is. And they're like, crap, is this going to work? Is this not going to work? And for the next, 10, 15 minutes, it goes around 6 other people. Bam. Now you find out. Did it work? No. You die. or maybe yes. I think that's fantastic. And, when I started hitting the beats, and I think I'm going to actually try to use that method of doing it on a requested roll like that. But when I started doing the beats specifically, I switched from one character to another character, and the character I switched to didn't want to go. She was invested in the story that was happening with the first character.
Yeah,
character
want to see what happened here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have found myself like that multiple times in Astral Drive.
Yeah.
I'm listening to this story where Philbilly is talking, is like going through this. Nellis is talking to somebody like from his past or to this demon that's been living in his head, and then we switch, and I'm just like, wait, what's gonna happen next though?
Mm-hmm.
I can't. I skip me. I pass.
Yeah, Astral Drive is. I'm lucky with Astral Drive because right off the bat with Astral Drive, I turned everything up to 12. So like everything, everything feels like you're on the edge of a cliff. Everything, even when you're just walking into a town or landing a ship, like it feels like you're on the edge of a cliff because just everything's so big. The stakes are so high in that game, and just like it seems like every time you guys do anything, something bigger happens. And so what's interesting is we've only had like 2 or 3 moments where it's just like it's like a calm and like somebody's just hanging out with their family or somebody's just talking to person A. And
Yeah.
what's great is because I'm that like that being on an edge thing, like other than sheer exhaustion from people having to work full days before coming and getting on, you know what I mean? I don't think
Right,
anybody
yeah.
wants to fall asleep during the game because I think they're genuinely interested. Everybody's on the edge of their seat like, oh, is this guy going to live or not, because of that razor's edge feel. But at the same time, when somebody just gets to hang out with their family, everybody's really happy to just see that that can happen. So they're invested in that too. And you end
Yeah.
up with this, like with Astral Drive, all three of you guys are very, very invested in each other's stories. And I've loved that from the three of you as players. Like, I set a timer to make sure you guys could play, but I know that there's times where, like, Brian is the same as you. He's like, don't come to me. We got to find out what happens. You know, I know Philbilly's the same way. You're all very invested in each other's stories. And because of that, it helps, but you don't always get that. Sometimes it's hard to be invested in stories. In the World of Darkness game that I was talking about, there are a couple of characters I have a very hard time being invested in their stories. I don't love the way they play their characters, and I don't love their characters. They don't really accomplish a lot, and it in no way, shape, or form speaks to me. So it's very hard for me to like stay in, which sucks because you know, that game master really wants everybody to pay attention because he kind of gives out experience points and stuff based on, you know, the last game and what other people remember about other people, not what they remember about themselves. So, like, I'm always writing down when other people do cool stuff, you know, so that I can make sure that they get their experience points. I don't think that particular section of that game is the hardest for me to pay attention to because of that engagement. And that's unfortunate, but that's just a reality. People are built different. Sometimes they're not going to be engaged in this thing for somebody else. And I think that like that's when the whole separation stuff becomes really tricky. Like I think we've got like a twofold discussion today. We've got the first fold, which we've just about finished, which is talking about separation and keeping the player engagement even when the character isn't there and they are just sitting in the back. I think the other half of this is people who are together and players are just not engaging or not feeling engaged to the story or not feeling like the story has anything to do with them. And I think we should cover that for the second half of this podcast, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's actually a really good point. And there's a lot to that we should dive into.
Yeah.
Because that's, you know, a lot of tables, a lot of players, they will split the party, but there's also a lot of time where they're together. You know, I have one table where a lot of my players are definitely going in different directions. I have another table where they will actively say, we are not splitting the party because they know I'm probably going to fuck up their day.
I can't wait to split the Ordo party. I can't wait because I know chaos is going to happen.
Yeah.
Immediately. And I think this is the first time that all four of us were in completely different spots. And I'm like, oh, it's coming.
And that was my opportunity to make it a ghost story for everybody out there. As soon, like, to catch up on Ordo real quick, when the party split, they all had different sections of a big location they were at.
Yeah.
And I had a moment to scare everybody individually and just sort of jump from character to character.
Did a pretty good job of it. Did a pretty good job of it so far.
Well, thank you.
Has not released, so don't spoil anything. But
right,
yeah.
Nope. That's all I'll say. But you know, it's just as important to make sure that nobody is getting, you know, I don't want to say like necessarily pushed to the side because that's another issue, but falling to the side not really necessarily having the space to engage, or people not being active when they're all together. That's another big thing to try and get everybody working together on something that can be it can definitely be tricky.
Yeah.
Do you,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, do you have any like personal ideas or
Okay.
times where it works?
So, okay. So speaking of the garage game again, I really wanted to give the game master a break because he's just been game mastering for years and years and years, and I know what that's like. So, and the way we do it is we were playing. There's 3 Fridays where we play. I'm there 2 of them. Phil's there 2 of them, and then Phil's there 1 that I'm not, and I'm there 1 that Phil's not. So, if that makes sense to you, just because of schedules and stuff.
Yeah.
So we had kind of this turning point where we switched to a game for all 3 for a while, and then we switched back. And I was like, instead of switching back, here's what I want to present. I want to present that I run a game permanently in the middle space so that he can play. He can have 1 game that he's playing. So the first game that I ran was like every once in a while when he wasn't feeling up to it, I would step in and we'd play this game that was a little bit more throwaway. It was kind of a gladiatorial game. There was definitely story there and they were kind of invested in the characters, but it was very easy to do because it was just like, okay, we're doing the gladiator game. So I had some random charts where I'd roll up like what was going to happen in the arena and what were the events, and they got to sign up for the events, and then there'd be a big scrum and they'd get money and get to get stuff. You know what I mean? It's nice and simple and easy and quick to the point. That game didn't work. I know some of the people liked it a lot, but like the people who liked it a lot, you could tell liked it a lot, and the other people were just like, I don't even want to be here. And it's because they were split up almost all the time. They were split up. The battle system for that specific system I was using for that game takes a longer time. And it was just like, it would be like you'd be in a fight and it would just be really long and the other people would kind of tune out. And I just never felt like it worked. So when I decided to take over, I was like, I can't do that again. Like, I have to adjust to what I'm doing. I have to try and make them in a party or kind of have a center point, which is not something I'm good at doing. I am much more good at improv and playing 1-on-1 with somebody, 1-on-2, 1-on-3. Like, that's where I shine as a game master. When I get into a large group where I have to give them a narrative purpose, tends to fall apart a little bit. Don't get me wrong, your games feel narrative. It's just, I like to put you in a situation, see what you do, and then build the story based on that. And it makes you feel more involved. But you really can't do that with a 5-person group, you know? So,
right.
I don't know. I'm getting long-winded on this, but this second game has worked way better. I made a system where the combat is much quicker and snappier. It's a lot more severe and scary for them, but it ends in like 2 or 3 turns. So like we get to the point. On top of that, I tried to keep the majority of them together for the most part. I'm letting them make their own choices. There's also a narrative flow that is kind of bringing them together. But I'm keeping that. They're definitely eating this up a lot more than they were the last game. And I think part of the reason for that is that I'm giving them each something very interesting to do. First of all, I'm keeping it paced so that when they are split up, I'm being very snappy with it. But when they're together, you have to make sure that there is something for everybody to chew on, right? Like, that's really the thing. Like, sure, you can, like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think as a game master, if you ever really want that player engagement, you should ever make a game that's just, here is a bad guy, he is in a dungeon, he has this princess, go get him. Because when you're not...
Mario?
Yeah, when you're not at all thinking about the players, their backstory, their characters, what they've put work into, when you're not thinking about that, that's where the engagement comes from, right? Because it's a conversation, right?
Yeah.
Like, so-and-so did not build his 2-hour terrible... Like, Phil Billy didn't write the half novel about his backstory of Nullus for me to not do anything with it. You know what I mean?
Right.
If I had just been like, okay, you're an orc with guns, and that's how I had treated him, he would not be engaged in the story. You know,
Right.
same with
Yeah.
same. And the other thing is too, as a player, as a game master, I'm talking too much. I'm sorry. I'm stepping on you again. Oh,
No,
I
yeah,
hate
you're
it. I've
good.
been talking for too long. I'm going to try and get to the point. As a game master, when you're looking at a player, right? When you're looking at your players, there's going to be one player who your brain gravitates to because that player's particular story your brain does more with than the others, right?
Right.
It's just the way it is. Like in this game, it's a pirate game that I'm playing. There is one player who made this character who is a white boy who is trying to be a shaman for the local natives because he befriended them. He hates pirates. He only uses guns. He worships this. Like, there's so much to do there, right? Then I
Right.
got
Yeah.
another guy who is just a French guy who wants to build boats. Where do you think my brain is going to build the story? Right? Like, it's not going to be the French guy who builds boats, but that's the trick. You have to build something for the French guy who builds boats. You can't just leave that dude hanging because even
Right.
though he's just a French guy who builds boats, you got to give him something. You got to engage him. You, as a game master, have to reach out to them and bring them into the story. So, like, and luckily the French guy who builds boats is kind of a psychopath, so he kind of made a whole lot of story all by himself by deserting everybody else and stealing a boat with a pirate. So it's kind of like, yeah, we're gonna do a lot with that. But like there's still plenty of other stuff that I didn't have anything for at first, you know?
Right.
So yeah, so like you've got to give everybody some crunchy morsel. Even if it's you were talking earlier about like nothing conversations, social conversations. That has a use though. Like if you see a player and he is just sitting there doodling on his character sheet while the party is doing something, you need to have an NPC go talk to him about something. Just
Right.
pick
Yeah.
something. Have that NPC engage with him so that he has to talk in character. Bring him back into that world. Even if it's like, what jam do you like? Like you're still at least engaging that player with something and bringing them into the story. You know, give them a moment where you're looking at them and you're telling a story about their character right then and there. Because if you treat them like extras, they're going to treat the game like extras.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. 100% agree on that. There's a lot there that
I
to
talked
discuss.
way too long.
No,
It
it's
was like a 7-minute rant. I apologize.
well, we got like a lot of good points here to dive into like a little bit deeper. Like just to going off the last one that you just said, you know, like if your character, if you got like 5 players there and one guy's sitting at doodle and it's a very like, you know, NPC or communication game and they are still all together, random NPC comes up to talk to them. That's fantastic. Um, a couple of ways to make that a little bit more engaging. Um, maybe make the random NPC press the player for something like in some way. Like make the random NPC a drunk gnome ready to just get into a fight with anybody and he just picked out one guy. The guy off in the corner doodling. Or maybe, you know, it's a pickpocket and the world's worst pickpocket just got caught with that one NPC. It could be anything. But there's a lot of things that you could just do to like just derail the static like momentum of the situation to create a little bit more dynamic environments. And another one that like you talked about and I think definitely bears a little bit more looking into is giving uh players various opportunities to use certain skills throughout a scenario. And you can think about this in a lot of different ways because a scenario could be a combat scenario, it could be a communication sort of based scenario, or you know, wandering through the wilderness trying to figure out something, or searching a castle that's you know barren for clues. You know, it could be any one of those types of scenarios, and you don't necessarily have to plot out every single room if that's not your thing. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it isn't. But if you know your characters, or you know your players' characters, and you know what their abilities are, it becomes super easy to do this. All you have to do is think about each one of those players, think of 1 to 3 skills, abilities, powers that they have, and make that, and just keep that in your, like, written down in your head. And when an opportunity, when there's a lull, when you need it, and somebody's sitting off in the corner doodling, bam, that power is needed. It could be anything. For instance, like, if it's the easiest thing is a lockpick. There's a thief. You really want to get him more engaged. There's now a door that the players have to get through that's locked. There you go. If it's a little bit more subtle than that, maybe it's more of maybe it's like a very NPC social heavy character in a dungeon. They can get a little lost in there. They can be a little marginalized or pushed to the back. Maybe, typically those characters have some kind of talent that falls back on education of some kind, or some other, skill that layers within their more communication style powers or skills. And so maybe it's a history thing, maybe it's a knowledge thing, in like, just off the top of my head, so we're not like, so we're very broad. Aether, Gerald Abrego is basically an accountant.
Mm-hmm.
Make it a money thing, like, there's so many things that you could do that are not necessarily, like, in the moment super obvious.
Mm-hmm.
But when you layer them in there, you make sure that every character has a moment to step forward and do their thing, and you don't necessarily have to kill yourself planning out an entire dungeon where the players don't end up running into half the shit that you wrote up. But you just know, okay, this guy, he knows money really well. There's a very valuable door. He's going to know that these types of doors, after doing an appraisal check, that they're really easy to break down if you knock them here. Or, that gemstone is always where they hide the keyhole. Something like that, Just come up with that crap on the fly.
I completely agree with that. Do you think that there was any reason? Do you think when I originally designed the season 1, you guys going into the barbarian lands, that there was any reason for an accountant originally? No, Gerald Abrego made an accountant, so you guys had to negotiate to find clothes and equipment to look like Northlanders in the town, and he had to do that. And it's an easy thing to stick in that feels like it was always there. That's where your improv comes in, right? I also want to point out, characters bring more to a party than numbers and statistics. And, this goes back to what I preach since the beginning of this podcast, which is anti-gamification of TTRPGs and more about role-playing. What does your character bring? Does your character bring the calm, cool head? Is your character the guy who's going to get them into the fights? Is your character, whatever that player's character is, you can give them that to do. Just because you have a heavy fighting, like a knight of heavy fighting ahead of you and a character who doesn't have any fighting, it does not mean that they are going to be useless there. Do they have strategy as a skill? Give them a couple of strategy rules. Maybe toss a couple of bonuses to the other players so that they can, get aid in combat. Find creative ways to get them engaged. When a player starts to zone out, it's not the player's fault, usually. Like, don't get me wrong, players out there, try and stay into it, especially if a game master put work into it. But if you start to lose a player, it's because you didn't do anything with that player for too long,
Right.
And they're just sitting there and they're getting bored. Like, you are an entertainer. Like, you are there to, you have to look at your table and see what your table needs. Where's your weak point? Hey, guy over here is having a ball. He's really happy. So I know that I can leave him sit for a second and go over here to guy B, who's been, drawing a little skull on his character sheet for about 5 minutes and is tuned out. Like, I can go over to him, get him involved, let this guy sit with all the cool stuff he's done, and try and work with him. Or even in a group, like, they should all have some plot thread to pull at. Something You want a player to be thinking about their character when they're not playing. Like that's the key to player engagement, in my opinion. Is it's the same as like when a really good game, when you have played a really good RPG, you're walking away from the table like, I cannot wait to see what happens. Thinking about all the stuff your character did, thinking about how the character is going to get out of the situation, thinking about what comes next for the character, thinking about what you want to do with the character, how you want to build that character, statistically or emotionally. It goes the same for the table. If you are sitting there and you're thinking about like what's happening to your character and what the choices you have to make are and what's next for them during the game session, that player's engaged. You don't have to worry about giving them anything right then.
Right, yeah.
You know, in the pirate game, like I said, I've got the shaman guy who's very easy to write story for. He is already wrapped up in two gods, like three gods at war with each other, plus a whole lot of weird systemic racism and all sorts of stuff. That's great. He just has plot thread after plot thread, right? Over here, though, I've got a merchant. This weird German merchant guy. But I gave him plot threads. So for him, he had to negotiate a way out of a terrible situation. And he had to decide whether or not he was going to take on a new partner for that so that he could get to the place where he actually has money and situation. And so he's thinking about, how am I going to build my empire? How much can I offer this person? Then you've got this guy over here who's a fighter who just wants to fight things. Well, guess what? He got in a big old fucking fight. You know? So like... You have those things. You just think about your characters, and you want those characters to be thinking about what's next for those characters. You know, if they're thinking about that, you've accomplished something. You know,
Absolutely. And like to like double down on that a bit. You know, you were just talking like making sure that if your players are thinking about what they can do next, they are engaged. And if they're in a combat situation, which you touched on there for a sec, like, and you know, they're not a combat character. They didn't wrap their character. They're not a barbarian. They didn't wrap them in there. Maybe they're out of ammo or spells or whatever it is. There's a couple of things that you can very easily do that I really love doing to keep like those characters that maybe aren't as combat heavy or combat focused very engaged and very useful, and keeping them in that mindset of what are my options as a player, you know, keeping them thinking about what they can do as a player, how can they contribute to the situation. One of the things I really like to do is maybe weird little like very quick fast puzzles in the middle of a combat situation.
nice.
If you've seen an action movie in the 90s, this is going to resonate very much with you. Basically, the countdown clock while the other guy's fighting off the bad guys. You know, one guy's trying to disarm the bomb while everybody else is dealing with the monsters.
Yeah.
You have like maybe like a wizard. He's trying to create a spell that would dispel all of the shadow monsters that are coming in, or maybe if it's like an Abrego type character where he's really focused on money, you know, maybe there's a puzzle there where if he sets these gems in a certain way, they will, you know, close all the doors and keep the monsters out. Yeah, these just random stuff, but basically it gives them an opportunity to contribute. And every time it becomes their turn, they're doing something unique and interesting, and they're having to try and think through their situation, because if they don't, their buddies are all going to die, and everybody's depending on them. And all their buddies are still looking like freaking heroes because they're running around with a giant sword, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's a good point. Like, give them all something to like be involved in. You know, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly.
So, before we wrap up tonight's show, do you have any last minute thoughts that you'd want to share out to DMs out there of just helping them keep their players engaged, drawing players out?
You know, look at your players, know your players. What did they want from the game? And that can be hard nowadays, especially with all the actual plays and live plays and people auditioning for spots at tables and stuff. You might not know your players. So you might have to get to know them at the table, which is a difficult thing to do. But that's where you flex that improv muscle. That's where you flex the kind of, just look around. Is somebody not engaging? Is somebody bored? Is somebody looking at their watch? Is somebody, doodling on their character sheet? That's the person you need to give something to. And just try to give something to everybody. Don't forget that every player there is giving up their time, which is huge, especially if you're an adult. They're giving up their time to play this game, to be entertained by you. Try not to let them down.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great takeaway. My final takeaway is ask questions in game and out of game. Out of game is pretty self-explanatory. Ask your players what it is their character wants to do, what they want to do with their character. That's simple. In game, there's so many different ways in the moment to ask that exact same question. It could be an NPC, that's easy. It could also be a puzzle and is sort of geared towards that character. And now the character has to answer a question, at the table about that, like, why does this character feel so strongly about magic? What made this character research technology, or become a tech if they're playing a sci-fi, whatever it is. There are lots of ways you can make your characters, your players have moments where they have to answer the question to the whole table for that moment. And that I think would really help them engage as they are, forced to not only maybe think about something they haven't thought about or reveal something that they really cherish about their character that they maybe haven't had a chance to do yet. So yeah, I think we got some good advice out there. Before we cut it out tonight, is there anything you want to plug?
Check out the channel. I know that we don't have a ton going on right now. That's mainly, just because of stuff. I think I'm going to put up I'll probably have already put up a video where I'm just talking about what's going on in my life right now and why we are taking so much time to get material out. Try and stick with us. We're gonna keep coming back with more. I do also want to shout out a buddy of mine who works with me now. He runs a place called the Board and Bevy in Kent, Ohio. So if you're in Kent, Ohio, or around Kent, Ohio, check out the Board and Bevy. It's got a web page, and you go there, you rent a table for $5, and they have this huge library of hobby board games that you can play, and then drink craft sodas there, and it's a really cool place. So I just want to shout it out. If you're around the area.
That's awesome. That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm of course shouting out the wizardsrespite.com. Check it out. Kind of in the same place as Zach. This year has been a little bit hard to launch on a couple of projects. We're has been a year. Yeah, we're getting to them. I think everybody I know, it has been a year for everybody.
Yeah.
So one way or the other, I'm sure everybody out there has got to be feeling at least a little empathetic on that front.
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys are probably feeling the same way right now.
Yeah.
Thank you though for everybody who is listening and checking us out. Please continue to do so. And I guess until next time, everybody out there, keep rolling them dice.